Ladies and gentlemen, there is a truth that transcends time, circumstances, and challenges a truth that has been etched into the very fabric of creation. God will make a way. No matter the obstacles before you, no matter how insurmountable the mountain appears, the God we serve is a God who specializes in creating paths where none exist. There is a deep, unshakable truth that speaks directly to every situation we face, no matter how daunting or challenging. It is the truth that God will make a way. This is not just a theological phrase we recite in times of trouble. It is the nature of God Himself. He is the way maker. He is the creator of all things, and there is nothing too difficult for Him. From the beginning of time, when God spoke the world into existence, He demonstrated His unparalleled power to create something from nothing. In the very first chapter of Genesis, we are told that the earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. But God spoke, "Let there be light," and light broke through the darkness. From nothing came everything. He didn't need pre-existing materials, formulas, or plans. All He needed was His word, and that word brought the universe into being. This is the nature of God, a God who does not just react to circumstances, but creates solutions even before we encounter problems. Throughout the pages of Scripture, we see time and again how God intervenes in the impossible. When the Israelites were trapped between the Red Sea and the pursuing Egyptian army, the people feared for their lives. They saw no way out. But God, who is the way maker, made a way where there seemed to be none. He parted the waters, allowing His people to cross on dry ground, and then closed the sea to drown their enemies. This was not the work of human ingenuity, but the miraculous power of God, demonstrating His ability to make a way in the most dire situations. We also see God's creative power in the life of Abraham. When God promised Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, Abraham and his wife Sarah were beyond childbearing age. The natural laws of biology and time said it was impossible, but God's word transcended those laws. In their old age, Sarah bore a son, Isaac, and from him came a nation. God made a way when there appeared to be no natural way. His power and wisdom are far beyond human understanding, and when we place our trust in Him, we open ourselves up to the possibility of the impossible becoming a reality. Let us not forget the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Here we find another example of God's intervention in a seemingly hopeless situation. Daniel, a man who had faithfully served God, was thrown into a den of lions by those who sought to destroy him. To all onlookers, it appeared as though Daniel's fate was sealed. But God, who is the way maker, shut the mouths of the lions, and Daniel emerged unscathed. God didn't just rescue him in a conventional way. He defied the natural order of things. This is the God we serve. He is not limited by our understanding or by the laws of nature. When He steps into a situation, He operates beyond the constraints of what we think is possible. The Apostle Paul reminds us that God is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. When we look at our lives through the lens of human reasoning, we often see insurmountable challenges. But when we look at our lives through the eyes of faith, we see a God who makes a way where there seems to be no way. This does not mean that the road will always be easy or free from obstacles, but it does mean that we serve a God who can move mountains, part seas, and provide for us in ways we cannot even imagine. In the darkest times of our lives, when all hope seems lost, it is in those moments that God's power to make a way is most clearly revealed. Think of the story of the resurrection of Jesus. On the day that Jesus was crucified, it seemed like the end not just of His life, but of all hope. The disciples, confused and disheartened, scattered, not knowing what to do next. But on the third day, something incredible happened. Jesus rose from the dead. In what appeared to be the darkest moment in history, God made a way. Through the death and resurrection of Jesus, God made a way for all of humanity to be reconciled to Him. What seemed like the end was actually the beginning of a new hope. So when you are facing a challenge, remember that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The God who created the universe, who parted the Red Sea, who shut the mouths of lions and who raised Jesus from the dead is the same God who is with you today. There is no situation too difficult, no problem too big, and no obstacle too great for him. His creative power is limitless, and he is always at work in ways that we cannot always see. When we face the impossible, let us remember that God is the way maker, and he will make a way. When faced with seemingly impossible situations, it is easy to feel overwhelmed and uncertain. The human response is often to focus on the problem, to allow fear and doubt to cloud our vision. Yet it is in the midst of the impossible that faith becomes not only essential but powerful. Faith, when placed in the hands of a limitless God, activates divine intervention. It is faith that moves the mountains, calms the storms, and opens doors that no man can shut. The Bible is filled with stories of individuals who faced dire circumstances and yet chose to trust in God's promises. One of the most powerful examples of faith in the midst of the impossible is the story of the Israelites when they were encamped at the edge of the Red Sea. The Egyptian army was closing in fast, and it seemed there was no way out. From a human perspective, their situation was hopeless. But in that moment of despair, God's plan was unfolding, and all they needed was faith to activate his intervention. God told Moses to raise his staff over the sea, and as he did, the waters parted, making a dry path for the people to walk through. It was not the strength of their own efforts, nor was it the wisdom of their strategy that saved them. It was their faith in God's promise that he would deliver them. They had to believe that even when it looked like there was no way forward, God would make a way. And he did. This story teaches us a crucial lesson. Faith is the key that unlocks the door to divine intervention. Faith does not depend on what we can see with our eyes. It is a trust in the unseen, in the promises of a God who is always working behind the scenes. It is easy to trust when everything is going well, when the path is clear and the future seems bright. But faith becomes truly powerful when we trust in God despite the darkness around us. It is when we stand at the edge of the Red Sea, with the enemy behind us and no apparent way forward, that our faith in God's ability to make a way becomes a testimony of his greatness. We are often faced with situations that seem insurmountable, whether it's a financial crisis, a health diagnosis, a broken relationship, or a career setback. The circumstances may appear bleak and our hearts may be filled with doubt. But it is precisely in these moments that faith is most crucial. Faith is not the absence of fear or doubt. It is the decision to trust God in spite of those emotions. Faith is choosing to believe that God is greater than any obstacle we face and that he has the power to change our circumstances. Consider the story of the woman with the issue of blood in the New Testament. She had suffered for 12 years, and all the doctors she had seen could not help her. She was hopeless, but she heard that Jesus was passing by. In her desperation, she believed that if she could just touch the hem of his garment, she would be healed. She acted on that faith, and when she touched his garment, immediately her healing was made complete. Jesus said to her, "Your faith has made you well." It was her faith in the power of Jesus that activated the healing power of God. Faith is not passive. It is an active trust in the character of God, in his promises, and in his ability to intervene in our lives. We may not always see the full picture or understand why we are going through certain trials, but faith means trusting that God has a purpose, that he is working for our good even when we don't see it. The Bible tells us that without faith it is impossible to please God. Hebrews 11:6. Faith is what opens the door for God to move in our lives. It is faith that aligns our hearts with his will and his power, positioning us to receive his intervention. Another example of faith in the midst of the impossible is the story of Peter walking on water. The disciples were caught in a storm, and Jesus came to them walking on the water. Peter, seeing Jesus, called out, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." Peter stepped out of the boat and began walking on the water toward Jesus. As long as his eyes were fixed on Jesus, Peter walked on the water. But when he looked at the storm around him, doubt crept in, and he began to sink. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" This story shows us that faith requires focus. As long as Peter kept his eyes on Jesus, he could do the impossible. The moment he focused on the storm, doubt took hold, and he began to sink. Faith keeps our eyes fixed on God, not on our circumstances. When we trust in God, we allow Him to work through us in ways that transcend the natural limitations of this world. In our lives, we may face moments when the storm seems overwhelming. But it is in these very moments that our faith can activate God's divine intervention. When we trust Him, when we place our hope in Him, He responds. Our faith in God becomes the channel through which His power flows into our situations. When the world says it's impossible, faith says with God, all things are possible. And when we activate that faith, we position ourselves to see God do what only He can do. God's timing is one of the most profound aspects of His nature, and it is often one of the most difficult for us to grasp as human beings. We live in a world that operates according to a strict sense of time. We have deadlines, schedules, and expectations that govern our every move. But God operates outside of time. He is eternal, and His understanding of time far surpasses our own. One of the greatest lessons we must learn as believers is that delays are not denials. The timing of God ensures not only His glory but also our ultimate good, even when we cannot fully see it at the moment. Often we find ourselves praying for something, waiting for God to act, and growing weary because the answer has not yet come. We wonder why God doesn't move quickly, or why He hasn't answered our prayers in the way or at the time we expect. In those moments, it's easy to think that God is ignoring us or that He has forgotten about us. But the reality is that God's delays are not an indication of denial, they are an indication of His perfect timing at work. Consider the story of Lazarus in the New Testament. Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, was a close friend of Jesus. When Lazarus fell ill, his sisters sent word to Jesus, asking Him to come and heal their brother. The response they received from Jesus, however, was not what they expected. Jesus delayed His arrival by 2 days. By the time He reached Lazarus, he had already died. Martha, filled with sorrow and disappointment, met Jesus and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." To her, the delay seemed like a denial. She could not understand why Jesus had not come sooner. But Jesus responded with a profound statement, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" Then He called Lazarus forth from the tomb, and Lazarus was raised from the dead. What appeared to be a delay was actually part of God's plan to reveal His glory in a greater way. If Jesus had arrived while Lazarus was still sick, the miracle of resurrection would not have had the same impact. But by waiting, Jesus allowed the situation to reach the point of complete hopelessness, so that when He performed the miracle, there would be no doubt that it was the power of God at work. The delay in Jesus' arrival was not a denial of His love for Lazarus or His ability to heal it. It was part of a larger plan to display God's glory in a way that would change the lives of all who witnessed it. This story teaches us an important truth about God's timing. When God delays His answer to our prayers, it is often because He is preparing us for something greater. We may think we know the best time for God to act, but God sees the bigger picture. His timing is always perfect, and He knows when the right moment will bring the greatest glory to His name and the greatest benefit to us. In the delay, God is working behind the scenes, shaping circumstances, positioning people, and preparing us for the fullness of what He has promised. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, reminds us that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose, Romans 8:28. This is a foundational truth. God's delays are part of His purpose for our lives. While we may not understand why something is taking longer than we hoped or why a door remains closed, we can trust that God is working for our good. His timing is not random, it is intentional. His plans for us are always good, even when they seem delayed. There are times when we may grow impatient, but we must remember that God's delays are often opportunities for us to grow in faith and trust. Waiting can be a process of refinement. It teaches us to depend on God, to trust in His goodness, and to recognize that His ways are higher than our ways. Waiting also allows us to prepare for the blessing that is coming. Just as a farmer must wait for the right season to harvest, we too must wait for the right season for God to bring about the harvest in our lives. The delay does not mean the promise is not coming. It simply means God is making sure everything is in place for the fulfillment of His plan. In the story of Joseph, we see another example of God's perfect timing. Joseph was given a dream at a young age that his family would one day bow down to him. But after receiving this dream, Joseph's life took a dramatic turn. He was sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. From the natural perspective, it seemed as if God had forgotten about Joseph and his promises. Yet, at the appointed time, God elevated Joseph from the prison to the palace, and the dream was fulfilled in a way that was beyond Joseph's imagination. The delay in Joseph's life was not a denial. It was part of God's process to prepare him for the destiny that awaited him. God used those years of hardship to build Joseph's character, humility, and wisdom, ensuring that he was ready to fulfill his purpose when the time came. We also see in Scripture that sometimes God delays His answers to teach us patience, perseverance, and trust. James 5:7 encourages us to be patient, like the farmer who waits for the precious fruit of the earth. Patience is not about doing nothing. It is about trusting in God's process while continuing to seek Him, knowing that His timing will bring about the best results. Ultimately, God's timing is a reflection of His love for us. He desires to bring about the best in our lives, and that includes ensuring that we are ready for the blessings He has in store. His delays are not denials, but rather divine preparations for His glory and our good. When we understand this, we can rest in the knowledge that even in the waiting, God is at work, and His timing will always prove to be perfect. God's purpose for our lives is not something He develops in reaction to our circumstances or decisions. Rather, it is a proactive and intentional plan, carefully designed before the foundation of the world. God, in His infinite wisdom, has always had a purpose for each of us, a unique plan that aligns with His divine will and His eternal kingdom. And the beauty of God's purpose is that it prepares the way ahead of us. Even when we don't see it, everything that happens in our lives is being orchestrated to fit perfectly into His greater purpose. From the very beginning, God's plan has been one of intention and foresight. He did not create humanity on a whim, nor did He create us without a purpose. Scripture reminds us that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and that God has a plan for us, plans to prosper us and not to harm us, to give us a hope and a future. Jeremiah 29:11. This plan is not a reaction to our mistakes or the challenges we face, but a proactive, eternal design that works all things together for good. When we look at the lives of the patriarchs in the Bible, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, we see that God's purpose was at work in every stage of their lives, even when they couldn't fully understand it. Take, for instance, the story of Joseph. When Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, it appeared to be a devastating setback. His dreams seemed far from realization. But God had a purpose for Joseph's life that was far greater than he could have imagined. Every event in his life, the betrayal by his brothers, his time in Potiphar's house, his wrongful imprisonment, was part of a divine plan that prepared the way for Joseph to become second in command over Egypt and to save his family during a time of famine. God was not reacting to Joseph's circumstances. He was proactively using them to align Joseph's life with His greater purpose. Similarly, when we look at the story of Moses, we see a man who was born in a time of crisis when the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt. God's people were crying out for deliverance, and Moses was born into a situation that seemed hopeless. Yet, God had a purpose for Moses before he was ever born. His life was intricately woven into God's plan to free the Israelites. Even Moses' early years, growing up in Pharaoh's palace and then fleeing to the desert, were not random events. They were part of God's proactive preparation to equip Moses to lead his people out of Egypt. What appeared to be a series of unfortunate events was actually God's divine preparation. He was shaping Moses' character, equipping him with leadership skills, and teaching him to rely on God's strength rather than his own. This proactive nature of God's purpose is also seen in the life of Esther. Esther, a Jewish woman, found herself in a position of influence in the Persian Empire when the lives of her people were at risk. When her uncle Mordecai urged her to intercede on behalf of the Jews, Esther initially hesitated. But Mordecai reminded her that she had been placed in the royal palace for such a time as this. God's purpose for Esther was not an afterthought, it was a divine appointment. God had orchestrated the events of her life to bring her to a position where she could fulfill his plan for the deliverance of his people. Esther's purpose was not reactive, it was proactive, part of a greater plan that God had established long before she understood it. The same is true for us. When we face challenges, setbacks, or moments of uncertainty, it is easy to assume that God is reacting to our situation, or that he is somehow caught off guard by our circumstances. But God's plans are not contingent on our actions. They are grounded in his eternal wisdom and purpose. He is not surprised by what happens to us, and he is never caught off guard by the events of our lives. In fact, God often uses the challenges and detours we face as part of his greater plan to position us exactly where he wants us to be. Everything is being woven together for his purpose, even when we don't understand the process. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, reminds us that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose, Romans 8:28. This truth underscores the reality that God's purpose is always at work, even when we can't see it. Every moment, every circumstance, every relationship, and every trial is part of God's divine design. His purpose is not passive, it is active and working in every area of our lives. God's purpose prepares the way for us in ways that we might not always see. Sometimes we may find ourselves in situations that seem difficult, unfair, or confusing. But it is in these moments that God is actively aligning the pieces of our lives to bring about his will. It is in the waiting, the struggle, and the season of preparation that God is making a way for us to step into our purpose. He is positioning us for something greater, something that we may not fully comprehend yet. But if we trust in his purpose and align ourselves with his will, we can be confident that the way will be prepared for us. In our own lives, we may feel like we are wandering, unsure of what the future holds. But God is at work, orchestrating every detail of our lives according to his perfect plan. We may not see how the pieces fit together yet, but we can trust that God, in his wisdom, is proactively working to align everything for our good and for his glory. As we walk by faith, we can be assured that every step, every season, and every circumstance is preparing the way for us to fulfill the purpose he has called us to. God's purpose is not just reactive, it is proactive. It is not just responding to what happens in our lives, it is shaping and directing everything for his divine plan. And when we trust in his purpose, we can rest in the confidence that he is preparing the way for us to walk into the destiny he has designed. Obedience is one of the most powerful keys to unlocking the path that God has prepared for us. It is through our willingness to follow God's instructions, sometimes even when we don't fully understand the next step, that the way is revealed. Often God does not show us the entire journey up front. Instead, he requires us to take one step at a time in faith. But with each step of obedience, the way becomes clearer, and doors that once seemed closed are opened. The Bible is filled with examples of individuals whose obedience to God's direction led to amazing breakthroughs. One of the most striking stories is that of Abraham. In the book of Genesis, God commanded Abraham to leave his homeland, his family, and everything familiar, and go to a place that God would show him. At the time, Abraham didn't know where he was going. God didn't give him a map, nor did he reveal the full plan for Abraham's future. He simply told Abraham to go, and Abraham obeyed. It was through his willingness to step out in faith and follow God's instructions that Abraham became the father of many nations, a man whose obedience to God had an eternal impact. Abraham's journey illustrates that sometimes God will not reveal the whole plan up front. His way is often revealed one step at a time as we walk in obedience. Similarly, in the story of the Israelites crossing the Jordan River, God's instructions were clear, but they required faith and obedience. God told Joshua to have the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant and step into the river. At that time, the Jordan River was at flood stage, and the idea of walking into such a river with no visible path ahead seemed impossible. But the Israelites obeyed. As soon as the priests' feet touched the water, the river stopped flowing, and the people were able to cross on dry land. The way was revealed only after they took that step of obedience. If they had hesitated or chosen not to obey, the river would have remained in place, and the path would not have been opened. God's instructions were clear, but it was their obedience that allowed the miracle to unfold. God's guidance often works in the same way in our lives. We may find ourselves at a crossroads, uncertain of which direction to take. The road ahead may appear dark, and the way forward may not be immediately clear. Yet, it is in those moments that God is calling us to trust Him, to take the first step of obedience, even when we don't know exactly where it will lead. Our willingness to obey, even when the full picture is hidden from our view, activates God's power to open doors that lead us forward. In the New Testament, we see another example of obedience in the life of Peter. One night, as Peter and the disciples were fishing on the Sea of Galilee, they had caught nothing. After a long and fruitless night, Jesus called out to them from the shore, telling them to cast their nets on the other side of the boat. Peter could have easily dismissed this as unnecessary, as he had already tried all night without success. But instead he obeyed, even though it didn't make sense. When they cast their nets, they caught such a large number of fish that the nets began to break. Peter's obedience led to an abundance that was beyond his expectation. Had he ignored Jesus' instructions, he would have missed out on the miraculous provision that God had in store. This story teaches us that obedience often leads to blessings we could never have anticipated. God's instructions may seem simple, or even illogical at times, but our willingness to follow them opens the door to His provision, His guidance, and His miracles. When we obey, we demonstrate our trust in God's wisdom and His ability to see what we cannot see. Obedience is not just about following rules, it is about aligning ourselves with the will of God, trusting that His way is always better than our own. Sometimes God will give us a small instruction that seems insignificant, but our obedience in those small things is often what prepares us for bigger things. Jesus Himself said, "Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much." Luke 16:10. Obeying God in the small, seemingly inconsequential moments of life builds our trust and strengthens our ability to follow Him in larger, more challenging circumstances. It is through this steady pattern of obedience that we develop a relationship of trust with God, and He is able to reveal more of His plan to us. Obedience opens the door to God's guidance in our lives. When we obey, God gives us more clarity, more direction, and more opportunity. It is through our obedience that the way becomes clear, even if it's just one step at a time. God's guidance is often like a lamp to our feet, showing us the next step but not necessarily the whole journey. But as we take that next step in obedience, the way becomes more visible, and God opens doors that we could never have opened on our own. Moreover, obedience positions us for the fulfillment of God's promises. When we obey God, we are aligning ourselves with His will, and His promises are linked to our obedience. In Deuteronomy 28, God outlines the blessings that will follow those who obey His commands. He promises to bless them in their coming and going, to open doors that lead to prosperity, peace, and favor. Obedience places us in a position to receive the fullness of God's blessings as we are walking in the path He has prepared for us. As we continue to follow God's instructions, even when we don't see the full picture, we can trust that He will reveal the next step. Every act of obedience is a step closer to the purpose God has for our lives. The doors may not open all at once, but as we walk in obedience, we can be assured that God is preparing the way for us, and each step of faith brings us closer to His plan. Obedience, therefore, is not just a one-time act, it is a continual process of trusting God, following His lead, and allowing Him to open doors we never could have opened ourselves. Through obedience, God reveals the way step by step and leads us into the fullness of His purpose for our lives. There is no greater proof of God's power to make a way than the testimony of His faithfulness in our lives. Throughout Scripture and in our personal experiences, we can witness countless stories of how God turned tests into testimonies and challenges into triumphs. These stories serve as powerful reminders that no matter how difficult the circumstances may seem, God is always working behind the scenes to bring about His purpose. Our testimonies not only reflect His faithfulness in the past, but also serve as a source of encouragement and hope for the present and the future. In the Bible, we find numerous accounts of individuals who faced seemingly impossible situations but experienced God's miraculous intervention. Take the story of Daniel, for example. Daniel, a faithful servant of God, found himself in the midst of a life-threatening trial when King Darius decreed that no one could pray to anyone except the king for 30 days. Despite this law, Daniel continued to pray to the God of Israel. As a result, he was thrown into a den of lions. It seemed like certain death. But God, in His faithfulness, shut the mouths of the lions, and Daniel emerged from the den unharmed. Daniel's trial, which seemed like an end, became a testimony of God's faithfulness and power. His life became a living proof that God can make a way even when the odds are stacked against us. Daniel's challenge turned into a triumph, and his testimony became a beacon of hope for all who would trust in God. Similarly, the Apostle Paul's life was marked by trials and tests that turned into powerful testimonies of God's faithfulness. Paul faced imprisonment, beatings, shipwrecks, and countless other challenges for the sake of the gospel. Yet, in the midst of these trials, Paul never wavered in his trust in God. He understood that his suffering was not in vain. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul wrote, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God." 2 Corinthians 1:3-4. Paul's suffering, his tests, were transformed into a testimony of God's faithfulness. And through his experiences, he was able to encourage and strengthen the faith of others, showing that no matter how difficult the trial, God is always faithful to deliver. These scriptural examples remind us that God is faithful to make a way, even in the most challenging circumstances. But it's not just in the Bible that we see God's faithfulness, we also experience it in our own lives. Each of us has a testimony, a story of how God made a way where there seemed to be no way. We can all recount times when we faced difficulties that seemed insurmountable, yet God intervened, brought us through, and turned our trials into victories. Perhaps you can recall a time when you faced financial difficulty and it seemed like there was no solution in sight. Bills piled up, debts grew larger, and you didn't know where the next paycheck would come from. But as you trusted God, He provided in unexpected ways, perhaps through a generous gift, a new opportunity, or a sudden breakthrough. That experience of provision became a testimony of God's faithfulness, a reminder that God sees our needs and is able to provide in ways that surpass our understanding. Or maybe you faced a health crisis, a diagnosis that filled you with fear and uncertainty. You prayed, trusted God, and leaned on the support of others. And through the pain and the process, God worked a miracle, either through healing or by giving you the strength and peace to endure. Your testimony became one of triumph over adversity, a story of God's faithfulness to walk with you through the valley and bring you to the other side. Many of us have experienced broken relationships or emotional struggles where the pain seemed overwhelming. Yet through God's grace and faithfulness, healing came. What once seemed like an insurmountable wound became a testimony of God's ability to restore and make whole. God, in His faithfulness, takes our brokenness and transforms it into something beautiful. Our personal testimonies, like the stories of those in Scripture, become powerful tools of encouragement for others. When we share how God made a way in our own lives, we remind those who are struggling that they are not alone. Just as God was faithful in our past, He will be faithful in their present and future. Our stories of how God turned our tests into testimonies can inspire others to trust in His goodness, even when the road ahead seems uncertain. We can look at the Psalms, where David often recounts God's faithfulness in the face of trials. In Psalm 34:6, he writes, "This poor man called, and the Lord heard him, He saved him out of all his troubles." David's life was filled with challenges, enemies, betrayals, and battles, yet he constantly testified to the faithfulness of God. And in Psalm 77:11-12, he says, "I will remember the deeds of the Lord, yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds." David's testimony was not just about what God did for him in the moment, but about recalling God's faithfulness throughout his life. He used his personal history with God to build his faith and trust in Him. Our testimonies serve a dual purpose. They strengthen our own faith, reminding us of God's past faithfulness, and they become a light to others, showing them that God is still making a way today. When we reflect on God's faithfulness in the past, it increases our confidence that He will continue to be faithful in the future. We can face the challenges of tomorrow with the assurance that God is still able to turn our tests into testimonies and our challenges into triumphs. As we continue to walk by faith, let us not forget the power of testimony. Our story is part of the bigger narrative of God's faithfulness to His people. Whether it's a personal story, a biblical story, or the testimony of a friend or family member, each one serves as a reminder that God is always faithful to make a way. Our challenges may seem overwhelming at times, but God is already at work turning them into opportunities for His glory. Just as He has been faithful in the past, He will continue to be faithful in the future, making a way where there seems to be no way. As we conclude today, I want you to understand that the truth we've uncovered is not just a nice idea or a comforting thought, it is a divine reality. God will make a way. His nature, His power, His timing, His purpose, and His faithfulness are all in perfect alignment to bring you into the fullness of His plan for your life. But there's one thing that makes all the difference: your willingness to walk in obedience. You may be facing challenges right now, things that seem impossible, doors that seem closed, roads that seem blocked. But I want to declare to you today that your situation is not the end, it is the beginning of a testimony. Every test you face is an opportunity for God to reveal His glory. Every obstacle is a stepping stone for God to show you just how powerful and faithful He is. Remember, God's way is often revealed one step at a time. He doesn't always give us the whole picture, He gives us what we need for today. It is in our obedience, our trust in Him, that the path begins to unfold. As we walk with Him, we discover that God's purpose has been preparing the way all along. And as we follow His voice, as we trust His timing, we witness how God turns our trials into triumphs, our tests into testimonies. Look back over your life and you will see the hand of God at work, guiding, providing, protecting. And if you trust Him today, you will see it again. God has already made the way, and He will continue to make the way. You are not alone. His power, His wisdom, His love, and His provision are always with you. So let me encourage you, don't allow the challenges you face to define you. Let them refine you. Embrace the journey even when the way seems unclear. Trust that God, in His faithfulness, is leading you to a place of victory. The way will be made, and when it is, your life will testify to the greatness of God's power, His love, and His eternal purpose. God is making a way. Walk in it, trust in it, and watch as He reveals His glory in your life. This is not the end of your story, it is just the beginning. And the best is yet to come.